Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. I'm your host, Ray Gerard, and this is the program that asks, well, what if St. Paul were alive today? What if he were here to write a letter to Americans? What would he tell us? Wouldn't such a letter, be terrific to have? He has written things that for 2,000 years people have studied and found to be so truthful and so beneficial. What if he were here to write a new letter to America? What would he tell us? Well, actually, we are going to give you precisely such a letter. Why do we think we can do this? We think we can do this because actually all we're really going to do is use one of St. Paul's letters that he wrote millennia ago to the Romans, the Ephesians, the Galatians, and so forth, and simply apply it to us here in America today, because the truths that he expressed in his letters are, in fact, timeless, and they will work equally well today. Now, today, the letter that we have, the message that we have from St. Paul is this: everything is lawful, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is lawful, but not everything builds up. No one should seek his own advantage, but that of his neighbor. Now, surely that can always apply in any place, any time, that we're better off if, in fact, we don't think of ourselves first, but we think of our neighbors first. Even though certain things may be lawful, they're not always beneficial. The overriding principle is to do what's best for your neighbor. Now, why would that be useful for us today? Why would that be useful for us to hear about today? Well, strange as it may seem, we're forgetting that. We're forgetting that very simple truth. Well, today we'll be talking about prison chaos. There are some stories recently that have come out in the news that are really surprising in what people are actually doing, what people in positions of authority are actually doing. For example, there is a case that came out of Quebec recently, Quebec, Canada, where a man killed a prostitute. In a violent encounter, he killed a prostitute. Now, that in and of itself, and as horrible and tragic in and of itself as that is not something that would garner attention coast to coast within Canada. These types of cases, sadly enough, have happened before, and sadly enough, they will happen again. But what is different about this one? Well, what is different about this one is he had some accomplices. His accomplices or law enforcement authorities. Now, if you think that's a bit of a stretch, a little bit of an overreach, let me explain. The gentleman was named Eustacio Galice. Mr. Galice, a 51-year-old gentleman, was incarcerated. He was convicted back in, 2006, with sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole, but no chance of parole for at least 15 years. In other words, he would at first be eligible for parole in 2021. Well, as it turns out, he was released on parole last year in 2019, regardless of the original court sentence. Why? Because it was just a day release. They released him for a day. And why did they do this? Well, they did this because they found that, and by the way, we should perhaps start with what his prior convictions were about. And he was convicted of conjugal violence back in 1997. And then 7 years later, in 2004, he murdered his 32-year-old partner, who was a mother of two, but he murdered her. Apparently it was his live-in partner, and he beat her with a hammer and then fatally stabbed her with 2 knives. Then after that, he wrote a message. After he had killed her, He wrote a message on the bedroom wall complaining about her or in some way that was very critical of her. He was still filled with rage that even after he'd done this deed, he had to write some message disparaging her after she was lying there dead. So he's a troubled individual. And anyway, and then he was convicted of that in 2006, and the sentence was imposed, 15 years, no parole, not even a chance of parole. And unless he was granted parole, he would remain in jail for the rest of his life. Well, they found him eligible for parole, as I say, even earlier than 2021, at least on a daily basis. And why did they do this? Well, a prison authority, the parole board found, and I'm going to quote here from their findings. There was a hearing, I think, in September of 2019, and here's some of their findings. Although you are still single and you say you aren't ready to enter into a serious relationship with a woman, you are able to efficiently evaluate your needs and expectations towards women. During the hearing, your parole officer underlined a strategy that was developed with the goal that would allow you to meet women in order to meet your sexual needs. The hearing allowed us to realize you managed, and this with the approval of your case management team, relations with women that the board considers inappropriate. Those were among the findings that they made. So obviously they're still recognizing that he's got issues. He's not ready to enter into a serious relationship with a woman. But they do think that he's able to evaluate his needs towards women. Well, that's an interesting way of describing a relationship between a man and a woman. It's what one person needs from the other. Anyways, so apparently there was some strategy that was developed with the parole officer that would allow you to meet would allow him to meet his sexual needs. Well, no, that's interesting. Someone might ask, well, why is a parole board in the business of helping to satisfy a prisoner's sexual needs? If someone's in jail, for killing a woman with a hammer and some knives, I would think that the issue before the parole board, the predominant issue before the parole board, is the safety of the public. Well, nevertheless, they felt that it was important that this person be given a chance to meet those quote-unquote sexual needs. And so they released him, knowing that he was going to frequent brothels, knowing that he was going to do that. Now, in Canada, that's a crime. Now, Canada's got strange laws on prostitution. They passed a law a few years ago, I think 2014, which was supposed to remove the demand for sexual work. And so what they did is they punished the people who purchased sexual favors. But the prostitutes themselves, they said there would be no criminal penalty for them. Now, if you are some kind of an institution, a hotel, a massage parlor, or something of that nature, and you aid people in their purchase of sexual favors, well, then you too are guilty of a crime. But the individual female prostitute herself, no, she would not be guilty of a crime. So it's kind of a sort of a disjointed kind of a law in that justice is meted out or penalties are meted out to some of the players that are involved, but not all. In any event, that's their system in Canada. Well, this person, and they knew that he was going to frequent brothels. I mean, they actually said he wasn't capable of a normal relationship with a woman, but that they were going to release him on a daily basis to satisfy his sexual needs. They knew he was going to go to these brothels. All right. Now, besides that, so he met a certain woman named Marilyn Levesque at a massage parlor, but she did not know of his past history. She did not know that he was released. He actually was barred or prohibited from coming back to the massage parlor. Because why? Because he had gotten violent at the massage parlor. So they forbade him to come back. So Ms. Levesque then made the mistake, the horrific mistake, of agreeing to meet him at a hotel. Man was barred from a massage parlor because of his violent activities there, but she agreed to meet him anyways at this hotel. Now, obviously, she didn't exercise the good judgment there, and you could question her judgment on that. But regardless, she obviously thought the risk maybe was not bad enough. It's hard for us to second guess, her at this point. But in any event, what she didn't know was that he was released from jail, and that he had previously violently murdered a woman. That she didn't know. She was an unsuspecting bystander in this regard. And so what then happened is, as you might guess, he murdered this 22-year-old girl in this hotel room. Then he felt bad about it and turned himself into authorities. So he's obviously troubled. He's still troubled. He was troubled in 2004 when he committed a violent murder against a woman. And here, 15 years later, even though they felt that, he's not a significant enough risk that we can afford to release him, he's still troubled in 2019. They misjudged him entirely. However, is that really the problem? I mean, a parole board who misjudges somebody and lets them out, early, or lets them out, grants them parole. Let's say this happened in 2021, and they agreed to let him out on parole, thinking that he was, sufficiently rehabilitated, even though he wasn't. You could say, well, they obviously made a horrible mistake in judgment. But there's more that's involved here in this one particular case. For example, all the way across on the other side of the country in Vancouver, there's a woman named Daphne Brahm, and she wrote an op-ed in the Vancouver Sun, a newspaper there. And she said, this whole case involves at least three disturbing notions. The first, she said, is that men, even violent criminals, have a right to satiate their sexual appetites with another person. And she's absolutely right about that. You have people in positions of authority recognizing the right of this person to satisfy their sexual needs. Should they? Should they be doing that? Look, if we not only paid attention to the letter from St. Paul that we quoted earlier, but to others that he wrote, we would find that, guess what? He says adultery is wrong. Sexual relations outside of marriage, wrong. Surprising, shocking. Obviously, the parole board doesn't believe in that. And so they think that men have a right to use women. That's first. Second, Ms. Brahm talks about the fact that there is a perverse idea that if a violent man is incapable or not ready to form a healthy relationship with another woman, it's okay for him to engage in an unhealthy relationship where, as the buyer in a sex for sale encounter, he has power over the seller. And he did. In this crazy form of justice that they have, he could insist that they meet at a hotel because prostitutes don't, she was working at this massage parlor. Prostitutes don't want to get their places of employment in trouble because they, even though she wouldn't be guilty of a crime, they would be. So they agreed to take chances. They meet people in hotel rooms alone without anybody else around. And so, the parole board knew that, this was going to happen, or was at least likely to happen. I mean, this was the express purpose for which they released him. And so they said, so she says, well, why is it okay for him to be able to engage in an unhealthy relationship? How does that, even if you're interested in rehabilitating somebody, how does that really even help him? I mean, obviously we can, Our focus is primarily now on the dead girl. But how would an unhealthy relationship even help him if that's what you're trying to do? You encourage somebody to engage in unhealthy, illegal relationships thinking that somehow that's going to help him learn how to engage in healthy ones? It's a crazy form of common sense, an inverted form of common sense. Then she says, finally, putting the sexual needs of a violent criminal ahead of the safety of other Canadians, including those who do sex work, suggests a grotesque hierarchy that is an affront to the constitutional and moral ideals of equality. And that's precisely true. They put the needs of this particular person ahead of other people. He was not ready to form a healthy relationship with another person, and yet they let him out, someone with a history of violent sexual behavior. They let him out, and this poor 22-year-old girl was an unsuspecting victim. Now and this last point, of course, is what if they had recalled the simple principle that St. Paul stated. If they were aware of it, if they were guided by it, they would have had this in mind. They would have had in mind the needs and the safety of the public. And young girls like this Marilyn Levesque. If they could consider the neighbor first, but they didn't. They considered the perpetrator first. Why would they? Why are we afraid to put the need? Why are we afraid to? Not necessarily even judge people, but to assess the needs, even on a relative basis, of people who are perpetrators of crime and people who are innocent. Now, like I said, Marilyn Levesque was a person engaged in the sex for hire trade, but in Canada, that's not illegal. That was not illegal for her. So she is a law-abiding citizen under Canadian law, and he is not. And yet his needs were elevated over hers. Well, in any event, crazy as it seems, the response to this is that you should have more decriminalization of prostitution in Canada. The thinking goes that if, in fact, and there's a woman who leads an organization in Montreal called Stella. It's an organization, a union of sorts, I suppose, if you will, for sex workers. And she claims that, she says that we need to decriminalize prostitution entirely because any kind of criminalization of it is rooted in the notion of women being objects, of men being able to control them, or of men's right to use women's bodies being important in our lives. Well, excuse me, but if you decriminalize prostitution, it would seem to me that all you're doing is, affirming that notion of men being able to use women. She also talked about the fact that, women have to take chances now. They have to meet in places, like a hotel and so forth. She says, let's see, before 2014, a man could pay a woman to have sex in a private hotel room and no one was committing a crime. But since the law changed in 2014 and now purchasers of sex have become criminals, you can't do that anymore. And so we need to decriminalize prostitution entirely. Of course, this particular crime occurred in a hotel room. So again, that doesn't make sense either. See, once you get to the point where you are going against, when you're going against rules and norms that come from a higher authority, and we're making things up as we go along, and you try to make the immoral moral, where you end up with things that are not logical. And this is what the people in Canada are struggling and wrestling with right now. And so this debate and this argument goes on. But in the meantime, a young girl now is dead because people couldn't get certain things straight. I mean, why does this happen? Why would people in these positions of authority, the parole board and the parole officers and all these people involved in this system, take a hardened criminal, and because they felt a need to worry about his sexual, why should there be any cause to worry about the sexual needs of a prisoner? Why wouldn't it be the case where you're in prison? That's one of the consequences of committing a violent, horrible crime where a person is dead. That person, the person who he killed in 2004, never has the chance again for any kind of similar pleasures. She never has the chance for any kind of life at all, any kind of activities in life. Why should we be so worried about this particular person being able to enjoy things that his victim from 2004 cannot? Why isn't it just that you're in jail for as long as you're supposed to be in jail, and guess what? The time is supposed to be hard. It is supposed to be unpleasant. You are supposed to suffer consequences. Why isn't that what this is about? No, instead, they're worried about his sexual pleasures. Now, why do we get to this state where things do seem to be a little upside down? Well, I would offer 3 explanations for that. 1, fear. These authorities are acting out of fear. There's another case that we're going to talk about in a minute, another case of more prison chaos, where women are now men who claim to be women without undergoing any changes at all. They're not undergoing any hormone treatments. They're not undergoing any surgical changes. They're being placed in female prisons. And guess what? They're committing crimes against women just like this man in Canada did. And so again, it's a concern for the perpetrator more than the victims that's guiding them. But before we get to that, let's just review what we're going to be discussing as we go forward. 1, there's fear involved in this. There's fear of being called insensitive, whether it's to trans people who claim to be transgender, or just insensitive to prisoners and criminals, that they have needs, that we're afraid of being called cruel. We don't want to be called that. There's a fear involved in this. I mean, why aren't people free? Why don't they feel free enough to go ahead and do the things that are right? They seem to do things that don't make sense. And so fear is one of them. If they had a peace of mind, their minds would be more open instead of closed to other ideas of fairness, closed to the ideas of looking at the other person that's involved, keeping an eye on the neighbor, keeping an eye on people like Marilyn Levesque, instead of focusing on just the individual perpetrators. Another thing is a misdirected sense of love. The concept of disciplining somebody out of love seems to be lost in our society. There is no such thing as hard love. There's a lot of sympathy, but not very much in discipline. We don't believe anymore that we're doing people a favor when we tell them no. They certainly didn't want to tell Mr. Galees. They didn't want to tell him no. And so there's just no hard love anymore. And there's a sense instead of people being able to satisfy their pleasures, people being able to do the things that they want to do, even if they're violent criminals. So the orientation that we have, which is not looking out for your neighbor, as St. Paul tells us, but looking out for the needs and the wants of the individual, of the subject, of the first person as opposed to the second person. If the focus is on that person, then we do lose sight of who the neighbor is. And then lastly, I think there's a lack or a loss of a sense of order that devolves into chaos. As God becomes less and less present in our thinking and in our society, he's less and less present in our minds as we go about what we go about during our days. We go farther and farther down paths that end up not making sense, as was the case with this woman in Quebec. We lose a sense of morals, and we lose a sense of the respect for law. We lose a sense for rules. There isn't really order. We have to make things up as we go along. There's, of course, a very famous atheist in the United Kingdom called Richard Dawkins. He's probably been the most preeminent atheist in the world for several decades now. And he has maintained for all that time that he's been in the public this idea that mankind can establish his own morality. We do not need God to behave properly with one another. We can establish our own ethics, our own rules, our own values. We don't need to get them from the Bible. We can make them up ourselves, and that we should be, and we are fully capable of doing that. And that's what he's maintained for decades. Well, just recently he gave an interview where he said, as much as he hates to admit it, perhaps it is a good idea to have God around. Perhaps it's a good idea for people to believe in God, even if he doesn't exist. Even if, and Dawkins still maintains that there is no God, but it's a good idea for people to at least believe in him, because then they have somebody watching over them from above, and that'll guide them in their behavior. And he said, again, he hates to admit that, but perhaps we need that. Well, why would a man like Dawkins be saying that after so many years, and say it so grudgingly when it's so hard for him to admit? Why? Because he too sees that the morals that society is adopting these days are going further and further down paths that don't make sense. So let's see if these explanations hold true in our next recent news story. And this comes out of the state of Illinois. In Illinois, there was a man. He was a man. He then declared himself to be a woman. Well, he was housed in a male correctional facility in Illinois, and then because he declared that he was a female, again, like I said, he underwent no real changes, no hormonal treatments. Well, I think he was undergoing hormonal treatments, and then he stopped them when he got to the women's prison, which was called this Logan Correctional Facility. Anyways, he stopped them when he went there. Well, the reason why this became newsworthy, this little transfer of this, I guess we would say he's a woman now. The reason why this is news is because there's a federal lawsuit that was filed. Well, why was there a federal lawsuit filed? Well, the federal lawsuit was filed by a female inmate at the Logan facility to which he or she was transferred. Why did she file a lawsuit? Well, she was sexually violated. She was raped. And she told the authorities about it, but they tried to quash it and they didn't believe her story. They tried to quash it. They actually punished her, so she's victimized twice now. They actually punished her for bringing a claim, an administrative claim forward. So eventually she filed a federal lawsuit against the prison authorities, against the warden and two of the guards who tried to get her to change her story and deny that the rape had ever even happened. So here's a woman victimized twice. She's victimized by the system. They let this person go to a female facility, even though he was a danger to that facility. And why was he a danger? Well, first of all, he had prior convictions for prior convictions of a sexual nature. Well, he had prior convictions for a number of things. Let's see. First of all, in 2005, he was charged with shooting two people outside a barbershop. Then let's see. While he was in a jail, while he was in the Cook County Jail, he strangled his cellmate. Then let's see. He served time for 11 felonies, including second-degree murder and attempted murder, aggravated battery, 3 counts of aggravated battery involving a police officer, et cetera, et cetera. So he was a dangerous person. And the woman who filed this lawsuit, who became his victim, said that he was very big and very strong, and that she was terrified. And from the first day that he was there, he started making comments and threatening comments to her, and she was terrified. And it was on that same day that he ended up actually raping her. Followed 4 days after this assault, the warden at the time, Glenn Austin, testified in a deposition as follows about this particular perpetrator. Quote, multiple tickets, serious infractions, previous PREA, in other words, Prison Rape Elimination Act allegations, previous allegations of rape in prison, previous ones, inappropriate sexual behavior, and a confirmed investigation that substantiated sexual misconduct. This was the background of this individual who was nevertheless transferred into this female facility. The prison authorities there at Logan then tried to transfer him back to the male prison, but they were stopped. The van who was taking this perpetrator back to a men's prison was stopped at the prison gate. It got as far as the Logan Correctional Facility prison gate, and then it was stopped. And why? Apparently the governor's office interceded. Well, what transpired after that were some rulings in the court system, rulings with regard to what the Logan Correctional Facility could and couldn't do with regard to inmates of this nature. And if you're thinking that perhaps in light of this rape that justice of a sort was going to be done here, you're going to be you're mistaken, and you're going to be surprised. There's a U.S. District Court judge named Nancy Rosenstengel, and she, in December, issued an injunction. So this incident happened last summer. In December, she issued an injunction ordering the Department of Corrections to provide hormones to transgender inmates and stop making housing assignments based on genitalia or physical appearance, close quote. So we're doubling down on this administrative policy of housing dangerous men with women. Let's see. Let's see. Oh, the lawsuit that the victim filed, ironically, was filed in federal court 3 days after another ruling by another U.S. District Court judge. And this judge was Judge Michael Mim, and he issued an injunction barring the Department of Corrections from moving Monroe, that's the name of this perpetrator, moving Monroe to a men's prison. They enjoined Logan from moving him to a men's prison. Not only was this guy moved in the first place from the men's prison to the female prison, not only did he then commit this horrible crime, not only did he have this history of these infractions as the warden testified in a deposition, not only all that, but now the federal court steps in and forbids the Department of Corrections from transferring him out of the women's prison until the Department of Corrections gives the court 14 days notice of their intention to transfer him back to a men's prison and gives an explanation to the court as to why the transfer is necessary. I don't know how to explain some of the thinking that's involved here. It appears that they're really more concerned with the rights of a supposed transgender person. You say supposed. He, as I say, stopped taking the hormone treatments when he got to Logan. So, and in any event, something else. The judge we mentioned in the first place, Rosenstengel. As I say, Nancy Rosenstengel. She, among other things that she ordered, was that that the Department of Correction had to develop policies to ensure that decisions about treatment for gender dysphoria are made by qualified medical professionals, ordered the correctional authorities to provide clothing and grooming products in accord with some gender preferences of a person. So if one doesn't want to, If someone declares that they're a female, then now the Department of Corrections has to provide them clothes and grooming products in accord with that desire that they have. And she actually ordered top prison officials to read the transcript of a 2-day hearing. I don't know, several hundred pages perhaps. Ordered prison officials to read the transcript of the 2-day hearing that resulted in this injunction. It seems a little punitive, perhaps. So not only did this woman have to file a federal lawsuit because she's not getting, any kind of justice from the authorities, but the judges that are reviewing, these situations are mandating that they continue, and they're even being punitive towards the prison officials who want to try to apparently keep in mind the safety of the female prisoners. It seems like everything is all on one side. It seems like all of the concern is for the rights of the declared transgender person and not on other people. So when is it the case that people who claim to have gender dysphoria are accorded rights and other people aren't accorded any? If people claim to have gender dysphoria, then they should be treated with compassion and respect and everything that can be done to help them in their situation. Whether that's in any event, let's just leave it at that for the moment. They should be treated with compassion and respect to do what is best for them, and what would be best for them we'll leave to another discussion. But while we have compassion for that person, do we not also have to have compassion for the female inmates with which some of these people are being housed? The letter from St. Paul said, things may be lawful, and these court decisions now are making all of this kind of activity lawful. But he said not everything is beneficial. Everything is lawful, but not everything builds up. No one should seek his own advantage, but that of his neighbor. So instead of focusing on, if we had a society and if we had prison authorities and if we had judges who lived by that sort of thinking, and they weren't concerned with their own interests first, but were concerned that of their neighbor first, then perhaps they would apply that same type of thinking when they made rulings about other people. And perhaps they would demand that if you're an inmate and if you're a male inmate and you claim to be a woman, that your rights end when they start to interfere with the rights of another person. If you prove to be violent towards other people, your rights stop there. The prostitute in Quebec City was an unsuspecting victim. She was given no warning of what she was about to encounter. Why does the rights of that incarcerated individual, who shouldn't have been let out at all for another 2 years, why does his supersede the risk to the public at large? As I say, one of the reasons seems to be fear. If we're not thinking about this in an even-handed fashion, if there is to be equality of rights, if we are to worry about discrimination against transgender people, that's all well and good. Those people have equal rights as anybody else. But equal rights means precisely that. Equal rights. Equal, not superior. Why do we have all of these administrative actions, judicial actions? Why do we have all of these governmental actions that are overlooking the rights of other people, the neighbor to these perpetrators? Why is that? Well, as I said, one reason seems to be fear. If you go against a transgender person in some way, you are declared to be a bigot. For example, the Trump administration recently, it was the U.S. Federal Bureau of Prisons under the Trump administration, just recently changed the wording to its policy on gender declared inmates being relocated from one facility to another, at least in the federal prison system. And what they said was that, what they did was they took out a sentence. Previously, the policy had said that the Transgender Executive Council, the Bureau of Prisons has a council called the Transgender Executive Council. And that council, it said the TEC will recommend housing by gender identity when appropriate. And that was the policy. It will recommend housing by gender identity when appropriate. Well, they changed that. Now the policy is that such reassignments will be made on a case-by-case basis, and that the TEC, the Transgender Executive Council, will use biological sex as the initial determination. But then after that, a number of factors will be considered, including the health and safety of the transgender inmate. Sometimes declared transgender inmates, if they're in a male prison, can suffer threats of physical abuse, bullying tactics, and things of that nature. So their safety has to be considered. But also, the new policy reads that they will consider, whether or not placement in a female facility would pose a risk to other inmates. In other words, equal rights. So what they said is these types of reassignments and relocations from one facility to another can be made, but that they're going to be considering a number of factors. Well, that was decried by certain activists as, quote, inhumane, as, quote, a deliberate recipe for violence, and, quote, inexcusable prejudice. So it was immediately attacked. So if you try to take into account the needs and the rights, the equal rights of female inmates, of potential victims, you are creating a recipe for violence, even though it would seem that when you do relocate supposed, male prisoners to female facilities, you're, creating, that would create the recipe for violence. But no, if you, try to consider the rights of all, then under the views of these activists, that, in fact, is the recipe for violence. It's understandable. I get the violence that they're talking about is the violence if you leave somebody in a male prison, from the violence that could be encountered by that person, by other male prisoners. But there are two recipes for violence that need to be considered here, not just one. But it's decried as inhumane and inexcusable prejudice. So if you try to use a sense of priorities, if you're trying to use a sense of order, if you're trying to objectively look at or consider a number of factors, then, as I say, you're going to be attacked here. And why should people do that? Well, in the UK, they've had problems with this. And just, I think, within the last year, the numbers of inmates that are declaring themselves, male inmates declaring themselves female, has doubled, I think, within the last year. And 41% of them are sex offenders. So this is a real threat. This is something that some of these inmates, people who have sexual predator tendencies, could easily try to take advantage of. So prison authorities obviously should consider whether or not just reassigning everybody to a female facility is appropriate. But if you do, as I say, you're going to be running into criticism. For example, a presidential candidate that we have these days, Elizabeth Warren, she's senator from Massachusetts, said, quote, when she was campaigning in Iowa at a campaign rally, she said, quote, "We have to stop putting trans women who are incarcerated into prisons with men where they are at risk. It is our responsibility." So again, the concern is for the potential physical risk to men in men's prisons who declare themselves to be females. But as I say, there doesn't seem to be the concern there for the equal rights of the females in the female prisons. The neighbors to these now relocated inmates. You're going to have inmates that get transferred into female prisons who still have all of the physical characteristics of men. And so we are getting ourselves to the point where what would be your first impression, your initial common sense impression, is being disregarded. It is now okay to relocate people with the physical characteristics of a man into female prisons, even people who have violent sexual tendencies. And you do it without regard to the factors and the circumstances. You just have to do it. If you try to consider the various circumstances on a case-by-case basis, that's improper. That's prejudiced. It's inexcusable prejudice. You can't consider the circumstances on a case-by-case basis. You have to always side with one party in that kind of a situation against the other. It does not make sense. If you have any sense of what is fair to all people involved, if you have a sense of the neighbor, Paul tells us that we need to think of the neighbor first and ourselves second. So when we're dealing with prisoners and we have to make decisions for them, do we not apply the same standard where they should be required to think of other people first and themselves second? If we're making decisions with regard to them and their privileges and their rights, do we not need to consider other people, potential victims of them, first, and consider their needs second? If we can accommodate their needs, fine. That makes perfect sense. And that's the duty to deal with people in a loving and compassionate way, even prisoners, even criminals, convicted criminals. But when you disregard the other person first, then we've got it backwards. And we're getting to this point. As I say, there's various factors involved here. One of them is fear. I think from this case we can see it at play here. People are afraid to go ahead and maintain the idea that you need to consider the neighbor first. We need to consider the potential victims first, because you will be attacked if you do. You will be attacked as prejudiced, inexcusably prejudiced. So there's the necessary fear that comes into play. And so everybody has to agree with the new transgender ideology, even when it poses a physical threat to women. That's the only how else do you explain an outright denial of a willingness to consider the physical risks of women who are not as strong, who are more vulnerable? Why? What other explanation can there be that we're not going to be concerned with those people? It does not. It is not rational. It doesn't follow a common sense kind of analysis. It's based on emotion. It's based on the momentum of an idea of this particular time, the wisdom of this particular age. There's a current. There's a momentum that's at play, and common sense, rational judgment, and rational thinking is not allowed. So that's number one. Two, yes, misdirected love, as we said before. Why don't we tell certain people that they have to give way to the needs of other people? That would be discipline. That would be hard love. We're not applying that here. And so if you have a prisoner, and if he gets a judgment from a federal court judge that tells the prison authorities, you're going to get punished. You have to read the transcript of an entire 2-day hearing. I don't know how they enforce that, but nevertheless, maybe they have to, maybe they have to come back and they take a book review quiz or something. But if the prison authorities are getting punished by a judge, mandating they have to read, the transcript and things of that nature, and you, however, the violent perpetrator, get to stay in the female facility, you get to do a violent act, and you do not suffer the consequences for it. That's misdirected love. That's telling that person they can get away with abusing other people, violating the laws of God, violating morals, violating standards of decent conduct. That's sending the exact wrong message. If we're supposed to be trying to rehabilitate people in prisons, we're not going to do it that way. And then third, this lack of any sense of order. Is there a sense of priorities? Is there a sense of something going from the top down? Is there a sense of dealing with things in a certain order? Like in the Quebec case, they knew this person was going to be violating the law. Well, we don't have a respect for the law anymore. Obviously, if governmental law enforcement officials are telling somebody it's okay to violate the law, we don't have a respect for law. We don't have a respect for rules. If we're telling the prison inmate in Illinois, you can stay in the female prison even if you've committed this violent act, there are no rules. There are no laws, at least not that apply to you. Where does that come from? That comes from being able to decide what is right and what is wrong, any which way we feel like, when we feel like it, because there is no real right and wrong. There is no right and wrong that comes down from above. There's no sense of God setting those particular rules. And so, sadly enough, it seems we may have more and more of this. We have chaos. We have things that simply shock people. They are so backwards, and they fail to make sense to such a degree that we have prison authorities, like in Quebec, shocking the entire country by telling people, hey, we're going to release this person on a day release so that he can satisfy his sexual needs. And, it's okay if he's going to break the law because that's important. You've got there's a minister up in Canada, apologizing, sending condolences to the family of the murdered girl. Well, condolences are nice. Condolences are nice. It would have been better if that person had been kept in jail. We just have got the idea of what's important wrong. The sense of order that comes from Paul, that came from Christ, was the other person comes first. And why? Because they are important, because they're created by God. That is why. We are losing sight of that. We've got decisions made by people in authority making no sense at all, and we're going to continue, I'm afraid, to have that continue as long as we stay away from some sense of God controlling things, as long as we continue to overlook these letters from St. Paul. Well, we hope that this has been a little provocative. We've opened your eyes to some things going on in our culture and our world perhaps you weren't aware of. We hope that it's been enjoyable. We're glad that you joined us. We hope that you'll join us again. Until next time, this is Ray Gerard, and this has been St. Paul's Letters to America. God bless.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.